Elias pressed his face against the wet bark of a pine tree, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for rest. Behind him, somewhere in the darkness, dogs barked with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. The sound cut through the forest like knives, sharp and relentless. "Keep moving," he whispered hoarsely to the others. "Don't stop, don't look back." There were 7 of them, 7 people who had chosen the terror of the unknown over the certainty of chains. Elias was the eldest at 43, his back a map of scars that told stories he never spoke aloud. Beside him ran Samuel, barely 20, strong as an ox but gentle as spring rain. Then came Ruth, the only woman among them, her eyes fierce and unbreaking despite the blood on her feet. The others, Benjamin, Moses, Daniel, and young Thomas, who couldn't have been more than 16, stumbled through the undergrowth like ghosts fleeing hell itself. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. They had fled from the Whitmore plantation in Talladega County 3 nights ago. 3 nights that felt like 3 lifetimes. Master Whitmore was known for his cruelty, but even more for his persistence. He would hunt them to the ends of the earth, not because they were valuable, but because their escape was an insult to his pride. Lightning cracked the sky open, and for a brief moment Elias saw the landscape ahead, mountains rising like dark titans against the storm, their peaks lost in clouds and fury. The Cheaha Mountains, Cherokee land once, before the Trail of Tears had emptied it of its people. Now it belonged to no one and everyone, a wilderness where the desperate came to hide or die. "Elias," Ruth's voice cut through the rain. "Thomas can't keep up." Elias turned to see the youngest of them collapsed against a fallen log, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. The dogs sounded closer now, much closer. "Pick him up," Elias commanded Samuel, who moved without hesitation, lifting Thomas over his broad shoulders like a sack of cotton. "We keep moving until we can't hear them anymore." "And if we never stop hearing them?" Benjamin asked, his voice cracking. "Then we die running," Elias said simply. "But we don't die in chains." They pushed deeper into the mountain forest, their feet sinking into mud, their clothes torn by thorns and branches. The rain was both blessing and curse. It washed away their scent, but made every step treacherous. Moses slipped on a moss-covered rock and fell hard, gashing his arm open on a sharp stone. Ruth tore a strip from her already ragged dress to bind the wound, her hands working quickly in the darkness. "We need shelter," she said, looking up at Elias. "We need to rest, even if just for an hour. We're going to kill ourselves out here before those dogs ever reach us." Elias knew she was right. They had been running on empty for days, surviving on wild berries, creek water, and the kind of desperate hope that kept a man's legs moving even when his mind begged him to surrender. But stopping meant risk. Stopping meant the dogs could catch up. Stopping meant another crack of lightning, and this time Elias saw something different. Through the sheets of rain, maybe a quarter-mile ahead, there appeared to be a break in the trees, some kind of clearing or valley. It wasn't much, but it was something. "There," he pointed, "we make for that clearing. Find what shelter we can." They moved as one, 7 shadows bound by survival, pushing through the forest with the last reserves of their strength. The barking grew fainter behind them. Either the dogs were losing the trail in the storm, or it was wishful thinking. Elias chose to believe the former. Hope, even false hope, was fuel. The clearing revealed itself gradually through the downpour. It wasn't natural. Elias could see that immediately. The trees had been cut away deliberately, though years ago by the look of it. And as they stumbled into the open space, more details emerged from the darkness. Shacks, 3 of them, maybe 4, their roofs partially collapsed, their walls sagging with age and rot. Scattered around them were the remnants of human activity, rusted tools, broken wagon wheels, piles of stone arranged in ways that suggested purpose, long abandoned. "What is this place?" Samuel asked, setting Thomas down gently. Ruth was already moving toward the nearest structure, her practical mind assessing shelter before asking questions. Don't care what it is, has a roof. Mostly, they piled into the largest shack, a rectangular building that might have served as a bunkhouse once. The roof leaked in a dozen places, but it was better than the open forest. Inside, they found evidence of previous occupants, a rusted stove, a table with 3 legs, moldy blankets that they wouldn't have touched even in their desperate state. Elias stood in the doorway, watching the storm rage outside, listening for the sound of dogs. There was nothing now but thunder and rain. Perhaps they had lost the trail. Perhaps the storm had been merciful after all. Elias. It was Daniel's voice, quiet and uncertain. Come look at this. In the corner of the shack, Daniel had found something. He held up a pan, the kind used for sifting creek beds, blackened with age but unmistakable in its purpose. On the wall behind where it had been hanging, someone had carved words into the wood, barely visible in the dim light. Coleman Mine, 1842. A gold mine, Benjamin whispered, and the words seemed to suck the air from the room. Everyone knew the stories. Before the removal of the Cherokee, these mountains had whispered promises of gold. White men had come in waves, tearing at the earth, fighting over claims, leaving scars across the landscape. Most found nothing. Some found enough to keep them digging until disease or desperation drove them away, and a few, a very few, had struck it rich before the claims ran dry or the law caught up with them. 4 years abandoned, Samuel said, running his finger over the carved date. Whatever was here, they left it behind. Ruth moved to the door, looking out at the storm. Or they died here, or got run off. Doesn't matter. What matters is those dogs can't track us in this rain, and we've got walls around us for the first time in 3 days. She was right, but Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something significant, a gold mine, abandoned, hidden in the mountains where no one would think to look. The irony wasn't lost on him. 7 escaped slaves finding refuge in a place built by white men's greed. We rest tonight, Elias decided. Post watches in shifts. Come morning, we'll see what kind of place this really is and decide if we stay or keep moving. They arranged themselves around the shack, huddling together for warmth, their wet clothes steaming in the enclosed space. Young Thomas fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted beyond endurance. Moses kept pressure on his wounded arm, his face tight with pain but silent. Benjamin and Daniel shared what little dried meat they had left, chewing slowly to make it last. Ruth took the first watch, positioning herself near a gap in the wall where she could see the clearing without being easily spotted. Samuel sat with Elias near the door, their voices low. You think we lost them? Samuel asked. For now, Elias replied. Storm helped. But Whitmore won't stop. Men like him never stop. It's not about the money we represent. It's about what our freedom means, that he doesn't own everything, that he can't control everything. Then we need to get further. Tennessee, maybe, or north to... We need to survive the next day first, Elias interrupted gently. 1 day at a time, Samuel. That's all any of us can promise. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder moved on, rumbling toward distant valleys. The rain softened to a steady patter, and in that quiet space between disaster and dawn, 7 people who had been property found themselves in possession of something they had never truly owned before. Time to breathe, time to think, time to imagine a future that didn't end in blood. None of them could have known that the true test was just beginning, that the gold they would find in the coming weeks would present a choice more dangerous than any they had faced before, that their decision would echo through the South like thunder, challenging the very foundations of a system built on human bondage. But for now, in a broken shack on a forgotten mountain, they were simply alive. And for people who had lived their entire lives as someone else's property, alive was enough. The mountain kept their secret that night. The earth beneath them, rich with veins of gold that men had died seeking, remained silent. but not for long. Morning came slowly to the mountains, filtered through mist and the lingering smell of rain-soaked earth. Elias woke to the sound of birds, a sound so ordinary, so peaceful that for a moment he forgot where he was. Then reality settled back onto his shoulders, like the weight of chains he no longer wore, but could still feel. The others were stirring. Ruth stood by the door, her watch completed, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. Samuel stretched his massive frame, working out the stiffness from sleeping on bare wooden floors. Young Thomas looked better after a night's rest, though hunger had carved his face into something older than his years. "No signs of pursuit," Ruth reported as Elias approached. "Birds started singing about an hour ago. That's usually a good sign, means nothing big is moving through the forest." Elias nodded, stepping outside into the clearing. In daylight, the abandoned mine site revealed itself more fully. The valley they had stumbled into was perhaps 200 yards across, carved into the mountainside like a bowl. A creek ran through its center, probably what had attracted the miners in the first place. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, heading downhill toward lower ground. Around the clearing, the evidence of mining operations was unmistakable. There were several shafts dug into the hillside, their openings dark and uninviting, shored up with timber that had begun to rot. Piles of tailings, the worthless rock pulled from the earth, sat in mounds around each shaft. Tools lay scattered and rusting, pickaxes, shovels, buckets with holes in their bottoms, and everywhere that same sense of abandonment, as if one day everyone had simply walked away and never looked back. "What do you think happened here?" Benjamin asked, coming to stand beside Elias. "Claim ran dry, most likely," Elias replied. "Or the owner died. Or he found out it wasn't worth the effort. White men are always chasing gold, but most of them never find enough to make the work worthwhile." "Still," Benjamin said thoughtfully, "they were looking for something. Must have had a reason to dig all this." Samuel emerged from the shack, carrying several of the old pans they had found inside. "Creek's running good," he observed. "Clear water, smooth stones. If there was gold here once, some of it might have washed downstream. Panning's easier than digging in those shafts." Elias studied the younger man. "You know something about this?" "My daddy worked a creek in Georgia before we got sold south," Samuel explained. "Master used to hire him out to prospectors. He showed me once before—" He trailed off, the memory too painful to complete. "I remember some of it. The technique." Ruth joined them, practical as always. "We need food more than gold. Moses's arm is infected, I can smell it. Thomas needs real rest, not just one night on hard wood. We can't run anymore, not like we've been running. We need a plan." She was right, and they all knew it. They had escaped, but escape was just the beginning. They needed food, medicine, safety. They needed time to heal and strength to continue. And most of all, they needed to be invisible, something that 7 black people traveling together in Alabama in 1846 could never be. Not without papers, not without a story that would hold up to scrutiny. "We stay here," Elias decided, "for a few days at least, see if we can trap some game, gather berries, get our strength back. The mine being abandoned means no one's coming up here regularly. The storm probably washed away most of our trail. We're as safe as we're likely to be anywhere." "And the gold?" Daniel asked quietly. Elias looked at him sharply. "The gold isn't why we're here." "But it's here," Daniel pressed. "You saw those shafts. Someone thought there was enough to dig for, and if Samuel knows how to pan—" "Gold won't fill our bellies," Ruth interjected. "Gold won't heal Moses's arm or put shoes on Thomas's feet." "No," Daniel agreed, "but gold could buy those things, could buy a lot of things." The words hung in the air like smoke. They all understood what he meant, even if no one wanted to say it aloud. Gold meant power. Gold meant options. Gold meant the difference between hiding in the mountains like animals and building something that might last. But it also meant risk. Any black person caught with gold would immediately be suspected of theft. They would be tortured for information about where they got it, whom they stole it from. And even if by some miracle they could prove they found it themselves, the law was clear. Slaves had no property rights. Even as runaways, even as free people, their claim to anything valuable would be challenged, contested, stolen. "Let's focus on survival first," Elias said firmly. "Samuel, you and Benjamin set snares for rabbits. Daniel, Moses, you're on water duty and firewood, but keep that arm clean, Moses. Ruth, see what you can forage. Thomas, you rest another day. I'll scout the perimeter, make sure we're really alone up here." They dispersed to their tasks, falling into the kind of coordinated labor that plantation life had trained into them. But as he watched them work, Elias couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's words. The gold was here, and they needed something, anything that might tip the scales in their favor. By midday, they had made progress. Benjamin and Samuel had caught 2 rabbits and found a wild turkey nest with eggs. Ruth returned with a basket woven from reeds, filled with ramps, wild onions, and berries she recognized as safe. Moses's arm looked worse, the wound angry and red, but Ruth had found some yarrow to make a poultice. As the sun climbed higher, Samuel wandered down to the creek with one of the old pans. Elias watched him from the shack, saw him kneel beside the water, filling the pan with gravel and sand. He saw Samuel swirl the water in slow circles, spilling off the lighter material, checking what remained. Again and again, Samuel repeated the process. Pan, swirl, check. Pan, swirl, check. It was hypnotic to watch, this ancient dance of hope and patience. And then, on perhaps the 20th attempt, Samuel froze. His body went completely still. Elias was moving before he consciously decided to, his feet carrying him down to the creek. The others noticed and followed. By the time they all gathered around Samuel, he was staring into his pan with an expression that mixed disbelief and terror. In the bottom of the pan, among the black sand and stone fragments, something gleamed. It was small, no bigger than a kernel of corn, but unmistakable in the sunlight. Gold. Not fool's gold, not mica, but actual gold. The real thing, the kind men killed for. "Sweet Jesus," Benjamin whispered. Samuel's hands trembled as he picked up the tiny nugget, holding it up to the light. It was heavier than it looked, dense and soft, the color of sunrise. None of them spoke. They simply stared at this impossibility made real. "Try again," Elias heard himself say. "Samuel, try again, see if there's more." Samuel returned to the creek with hands that shook. He filled the pan again, this time more carefully, selecting gravel from a slightly different spot. The process seemed to take forever. Pan swirl check, and then 2 more nuggets, smaller than the first, but gold nonetheless. "It's in the creek," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's washing down from somewhere upstream. That's how it works. The heavy gold settles in the bends and behind rocks where the water slows down. If there's this much just sitting in the creek bed—" He didn't need to finish the thought. If gold was washing into the creek, that meant the source was still up there, somewhere in those abandoned shafts, or deeper in the mountain itself. Ruth was the first to speak the question they all carried. "What do we do with this?" It was the right question, the only question. Finding gold wasn't the same as being able to use it. For white men, gold meant wealth, opportunity, a better future. For 7 escaped slaves in Alabama in 1846, gold might just mean a faster death. "We think about it," Elias said carefully. "We don't make decisions when we're hungry and hurt and scared. We take care of ourselves first. We heal, we get strong, and then we decide." But even as he said it, Elias knew the decision had already been made. You don't find gold and walk away. You don't stumble into possibility and turn your back on it. That wasn't human nature. And it certainly wasn't the nature of people who had spent their entire lives being told they were nothing, owned nothing, deserved nothing. That night, they cooked the rabbits and eggs over a small fire, being careful to keep the smoke low and dispersed. Moses's fever broke, probably from the yarrow poultice rather than any divine intervention, though Ruth whispered a prayer anyway. Thomas actually smiled for the first time since they had run, his belly full and his body warm. As darkness fell, Samuel went back to the creek. By firelight he panned for another hour, and when he returned, he had a small pile of nuggets and flakes in a piece of cloth. Not a fortune, but more gold than any of them had ever seen in one place. "It's good ground," Samuel reported to Elias quietly, away from the others. "The kind of ground men would kill for if they knew it was here." The mine didn't run dry. Someone just didn't know how to work it properly, or they got scared off, or... "I don't know. But there's gold here, Elias. Real gold. Maybe a lot of it." Elias stared at the small bundle of gleaming metal. In the firelight, it looked like captured sunshine, like solidified hope. It looked like danger. "If we work this," he said slowly, "we have to be smart about it. Can't let anyone know. Can't draw attention. And when we have enough, if we get enough, we can't just walk into town and spend it." "That's a death sentence, I know," Samuel replied. "But Elias, what if this is why we made it here? What if this is why we survived the dogs and the rain and everything else? What if this is how we save ourselves, how we save others?" The weight of that possibility was almost too heavy to bear. With gold, they could buy their own freedom legally, forge papers that would hold up to scrutiny. With gold, they could buy land, establish themselves somewhere far from Alabama. With gold, they could return south and purchase the freedom of family members left behind. With gold, they could become more than runaway slaves. They could become a threat to the entire system that had enslaved them. "We work it," Elias decided, "carefully, quietly. We take what the mountain gives us, and we use it to do something that matters." Samuel nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Freedom." "More than that," Elias said. "Freedom for others. That's what gold can buy that matters. Not comfort for us, though Lord knows we deserve it, but freedom for others still in chains. That's the only way this is worth the risk." They shook hands on it there in the darkness, two men who had been property making a pact over stolen time and found gold. Around them, the mountain stood silent and ancient, keeping secrets that went back longer than any human memory. The Cherokee had known these hills, had lived here, loved here, died here. White men had come seeking wealth and found only emptiness. And now 7 black souls, escaped from bondage, were about to write a new chapter in the mountain's story, one that would shake the South to its foundations. 3 weeks later, they had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost like living rather than merely surviving. The work was brutal. Mining always was. But it was their work, done on their own time, for their own future. That made all the difference. They had decided to focus on the creek first. Samuel's instinct had been correct. The gold was washing down from somewhere upstream, collecting in the bends and behind large rocks where the water slowed. Panning was slower than shaft mining, but it was safer and quieter. They couldn't risk the sound of pickaxes ringing against stone, echoing down the mountain. Each day they worked in shifts. 2 people would pan the creek from dawn until midday, while 2 others set snares and foraged for food. One person kept watch from the ridge, looking for any sign of riders or dogs. The remaining 2 rested or worked on improving their camp. They had reinforced the largest shack, patching the roof with bark and mud, building a proper fireplace that vented smoke through a carefully constructed chimney that dispersed it into the tree canopy. They had dug a cold storage pit lined with stones from the creek, where they could keep meat fresh for days. They had even constructed a crude shower using a bucket and rope, fed by creek water, a luxury that made Ruth weep the first time she stood under it and felt clean water washing away weeks of accumulated grime and fear. The gold accumulated slowly but steadily. Samuel had taught the others his technique, and they all took turns learning the patient art of panning. The trick, he explained, was reading the creek, understanding where the heavy gold would naturally settle, where the water's current would push it, where bedrock caught and held it. It was part science, part intuition, and part simple persistence. By the end of the first week, they had perhaps half an ounce, small nuggets and fine flakes that Samuel carefully stored in a leather pouch he had sewn from rabbit skins. By the end of the second week, they had tripled that. The third week brought their best finds yet, a nugget the size of a bean and several others nearly as large. Creeks starting to play out in the easy spots, Samuel reported during one of their evening meetings. They had begun gathering each night after supper to discuss the work, make decisions collectively. It was Ruth who had insisted on this. "We worked as slaves long enough," she had said. "We do this free. We do this together. Everyone gets a say." "So what do you suggest?" Elias asked. Samuel gestured upstream. "The gold's coming from somewhere above us. There's a falls about a quarter-mile up. I saw it when I was scouting. Gold accumulates at the base of waterfalls. But more than that, the main vein has to be up there somewhere. Those shafts—" He nodded toward the dark openings in the hillside. "Someone was digging for a reason. They just might not have found it before they gave up." "You want to go into the shafts?" Daniel said. It wasn't a question. "Eventually, yes. But first, I want to work the falls. If I'm right, there could be a lot more gold there than what we've been finding down here." They all looked at Elias, who had become their de facto leader, not by proclamation, but by natural consensus. He was the oldest, the most cautious, the one who thought 3 steps ahead. They trusted his judgment. "Moses," Elias said, "how's your arm?" Moses flexed his hand, rotating his wrist. The wound had healed cleanly under Ruth's care, leaving a scar but no permanent damage, strong enough to work. "Then tomorrow Samuel and Moses take the falls, Benjamin and Daniel on the lower creek. Ruth and Thomas forage and hunt. I'll take the watch." He looked at each of them in turn. "We're doing well, better than I dared hope. But we can't get careless. Whitmore is still out there. Bounty hunters are still out there. We're still fugitives, and if we're caught, gold won't save us. It'll just give them one more thing to torture us about." The sobering reminder settled over the group like a blanket. For all the strange normalcy they had built here in the mountains, they were still hunted people, still property in the eyes of the law, still one bad piece of luck away from recapture and death. "How much do we need?" Thomas asked quietly. The youngest among them had grown up in the past weeks, his boyish softness hardening into something more resilient. "How much gold before we can do something with it?" It was the question they all carried but rarely spoke aloud. The gold was accumulating, yes, but to what end? When would they have enough? What would they do with it? How would they use it without being caught? "Depends on what we want to buy," Ruth answered pragmatically. "Freedom papers for one person can be forged for maybe $20 if you know the right people. Real papers, bought legal from a master who's selling, might run 100 or more per person. Land costs different depending on where and how much. A small farm, maybe 200 acres with a house, that could be anywhere from $300 to $1,000 depending on the state." The numbers were staggering. At current gold prices, around $20 per ounce, they would need substantial weight to accomplish anything meaningful. They had perhaps 2 ounces now, enough to buy forged papers for maybe 2 people, nowhere near enough to purchase land or free multiple slaves. "We keep working," Elias said firmly. "We build our stake, and when the time comes, we'll know what to do with it." The next morning, Samuel and Moses headed upstream with their pans and determination. Elias watched them go, then climbed to his watching spot on the ridge. From here, he could see down the mountain toward the lower valleys, watch the main trails for any sign of riders. The view was spectacular in the morning light. The mountains rolled away in layers of blue and green, mist hanging in the valleys like sleeping ghosts. Somewhere down there was the world of plantations and slavery, of masters and overseers, of laws designed to crush people like him under their weight. But up here, for this moment, he was free. The morning passed quietly. Too quietly. Elias had learned to trust his instincts during 43 years of survival, and something felt wrong. Not danger wrong, but different wrong. The birds were singing, the wind was blowing, everything seemed normal, but there was a quality to the air, a tension that made the hair on his neck stand up. Around noon he saw them, 3 riders, moving slowly along the trail far below. Too far to see details, but close enough to confirm they were white men, probably armed, definitely searching for something. His heart began to hammer in his chest. They weren't coming up the mountain, not yet. But they were working a pattern, moving back and forth across the lower slopes, search pattern, hunting pattern. Elias waited until they moved out of sight, then made his way quickly back to camp. Ruth and Thomas were there, preparing a midday meal. Benjamin and Daniel were at the lower creek. Samuel and Moses were still upstream. "Riders," Elias said quietly. "3 of them, lower slopes, searching." Ruth's face went hard. "How close?" "Not close yet, but they're working their way up. Could be they're not looking for us specifically. Could be hunting deer or surveying. But we need to be ready to move if they come higher." They spent the afternoon in tense preparation. They packed their essential supplies in bundles that could be grabbed quickly. They scattered the more obvious signs of their presence, kicking dirt over fire pits, dispersing the trash from their meals. They removed the gold from its hiding spot in the shack and distributed it among all 7 of them. If they had to run and got separated, at least the gold wouldn't all be in one place. Samuel and Moses returned near sunset, tired but excited. They had found the falls, and as Samuel predicted, the gold there was plentiful. In 1 day of work, they had collected nearly ½ an ounce, more than they usually got in 3 days of panning the lower creek. But the news of the riders dampened their excitement. "Could be they'll move on," Samuel said hopefully. "Could be they're just passing through." "Could be," Elias agreed, "but we prepare for the worst. Tomorrow, no one works the creek. We spend the day ready to move if we need to. Daniel and I will scout below, see if the riders are still around. Everyone else stays here, stays quiet, stays ready." That night, they didn't light a fire. They ate cold food and spoke in whispers. The mountain seemed darker than usual, the stars hidden by clouds that promised rain. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its voice lonely and haunting. "You think they'll find us?" Thomas asked Elias, as they sat watch together. "Not if we're smart," Elias replied. "Not if we're careful. We've been lucky so far, maybe the luckiest fugitives in Alabama, but luck runs out. It always does. What matters is what we do when it does." "The gold," Thomas said. "It's real, isn't it? I mean, I see it, I feel it, but it still seems like a dream. Like I'm going to wake up back in the fields and none of this will have happened." Elias understood the feeling. Even now, weeks into their freedom, part of him expected to wake up in the slave quarters, feel the overseer's whip, hear the morning bell calling him to labor he would never own. Freedom was still so new, so fragile, that it felt like something that could be snatched away at any moment. "It's real," he told Thomas. "The gold is real. Our freedom is real. And what we're going to do with both of them, that's going to be real too. We're going to use this gold to free others, Thomas. We're going to use it to fight back against the people who thought they could own us forever." "How?" "I don't know yet," Elias admitted, "but we'll figure it out. 7 minds working together can solve most problems. And we're not just 7 people anymore. We're 7 people with resources, with options, with something to offer. That changes everything." The rain started around midnight, soft at first. then harder. It drummed on the patched roof of their shack, creating a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Elias thought about the riders below, probably seeking shelter themselves. He thought about Whitmore back at the plantation, wondering what had become of his missing property. He thought about all the people still in chains, working fields they didn't own, building wealth they would never see. And he thought about gold, buried in the mountain, waiting to be found and transformed into something that mattered, something that could change lives, something that could challenge the very foundations of a society built on human bondage. They were going to need more time, more gold, more luck, but for the first time since they had run, Elias believed they might actually pull it off. They might actually become something more than runaway slaves hiding in the mountains. They might become a threat. The riders moved on after 2 days, never climbing high enough to discover the mine, but their presence had been a wake-up call. Eventually someone would find them. Eventually their luck would run out. They needed a plan beyond simply accumulating gold. It was Ruth who proposed the solution. They had been working the falls for nearly 2 months now. The weather had turned colder, autumn painting the mountains in shades of fire and gold. Their cash had grown to nearly 8 ounces, worth roughly $160 at current prices. Still not enough to buy land or free multiple people, but enough to start making moves. "We can't use this gold ourselves," Ruth said during one of their evening councils. "Not directly. 7 black folks showing up anywhere with gold is going to draw questions we can't answer. But what if we found someone who could use it for us?" "You mean a white person?" Benjamin asked skeptically. "Someone we trust with everything we've worked for?" "Not someone we trust," Ruth clarified. "Someone we can leverage. Someone who has as much to lose as we do if the arrangement goes bad." She had been thinking about this, Elias could see, probably for weeks. Ruth had always been the strategic one, the planner. On the plantation she had managed the master's household, tracking supplies, managing schedules, navigating the complex social dynamics that kept the big house running. Her mind worked in systems and solutions. "Go on," Elias encouraged. "There are white folks who help runaways," Ruth continued. "The Underground Railroad isn't just stories, it's real. There are Quakers, abolitionists, people who believe slavery is wrong and are willing to risk something to help. Not many here in Alabama, but they exist. And some of them have connections north, ways to move people and money." "How do we find these people?" Moses asked. "We don't," Ruth said. "Not at first. First we find a broker, someone who deals in information and transactions that exist outside the law. Someone who knows how to move money without drawing attention, and we offer them something they can't refuse, a percentage." The plan took shape over several evenings of discussion. They would need to get their gold to a city. Birmingham was closest, though still dangerous. They would need to convert it to cash or banknotes through a broker who specialized in questionable transactions. These people existed in every city, working the gray areas between legal and illegal commerce. They charged steep fees, but they asked no questions and kept their mouths shut. Once they had legitimate money, they could begin the real work, buying freedom papers for slaves in Alabama, purchasing small plots of land in non-slave states, funding the Underground Railroad to help others escape. The gold from the mountain could become a weapon against slavery itself. But first, they needed someone to go to Birmingham, someone who could pass as a free black person, who could navigate a city without drawing suspicion, who could make contact with the right people and return with their money converted into usable currency. The choice was obvious. Samuel. He was young, strong, intelligent. He could read and write. His previous master had used him as a clerk and had taught him numbers and letters for business purposes. He'd spent time in cities before, knew how to move through white spaces without triggering the defensive hostility that free black people often faced. And he was brave enough to try. "I'll need papers," Samuel said when they proposed it to him. "Freedom papers, or at least a travel pass, something that explains why I'm on the road and where I'm going." Daniel, who had worked in his master's office and had a gift for mimicry, believed he could forge something convincing. They had found paper and ink in the abandoned mine office, old and faded, but usable, with Samuel describing what real freedom papers looked like, and Daniel practicing the flowery script that white officials used. They created a document that might hold up to casual inspection. It declared Samuel to be Samuel Freeman. They had all chosen new surnames for their free lives. A freedman from Tennessee, traveling to Birmingham on business for his employer, a merchant named Jonathan Blackwood. The whole thing was pure fiction, but it looked official. That was what mattered. They spent 2 weeks preparing for the journey. They couldn't send Samuel with raw gold, too suspicious, too obviously stolen or found. Instead, they melted several ounces in a makeshift forge, creating a single lumpy ingot they could hide in a hollowed-out Bible. It wasn't subtle, but it was easier to conceal than multiple small pieces. Ruth sewed clothes for Samuel from cloth they had scavenged and cleaned. Nothing fancy, but neat and respectable. The kind of clothes a free black man with a decent job might wear. They cut his hair, washed him thoroughly, made sure every detail of his appearance suggested a person with dignity and autonomy, rather than someone who had been living in the woods like an animal. The night before Samuel left, they held something like a prayer service, though none of them were particularly religious. Slavery had complicated their relationship with God. How could a just deity permit such evil? But they still carried the rituals of faith, the communal reaching towards something greater than themselves. "You come back to us," Ruth told Samuel, gripping his shoulders with fierce affection. "You hear me? I don't care about the money if it means losing you. You come back." "I will," Samuel promised. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if I have trouble making connections, but I'll come back. And when I do, we start changing things for real." He left at dawn, heading down the mountain with nothing but his forged papers, his hidden gold, and a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Elias walked with him to the edge of their territory, to the point where the mining valley gave way to the broader wilderness. "Be careful who you trust," Elias advised. "The world is full of people who will sell you back into slavery for the price of a drink. Stay in public spaces where possible. Don't let anyone get you alone, and if it goes wrong, if you get caught, you don't know where this gold came from. You found it, you stole it, whatever story works, but you don't lead them back to us." "I understand," Samuel said. Then, more quietly, "What we're doing, it matters, doesn't it? This isn't just about us anymore." "It never was," Elias replied. 7 of us got out, but there are millions still in chains. If we can use this gold to free even a few, if we can support the people trying to end this evil system, then maybe our running meant something. Maybe we're part of something bigger than just our own survival." They embraced quickly, awkwardly. Men who had been trained never to show affection, never to admit they cared for each other, struggling against that programming. Then Samuel was gone, disappearing down the mountain trail, becoming just another traveler on just another road. The waiting was harder than the work had been. For 3 weeks, the remaining 6 worked the falls and the creek with mechanical efficiency. They accumulated more gold, close to 12 ounces total now. But it felt hollow without Samuel there to share the discoveries. Every evening they would gather and someone would say, "Maybe tomorrow," and everyone else would nod, pretending they weren't worried sick. Thomas took Samuel's absence especially hard. The two had become close during their months in the mountains, and Thomas had started to see Samuel as an older brother. He worked himself to exhaustion every day, panning until his hands bled, as if physical labor could somehow bring Samuel back faster. "He'll be all right," Ruth kept saying. "Samuel's smart. He knows how to handle himself." But even Ruth's confidence had limits. By the end of the 3rd week, she was pacing the camp at night, unable to sleep, starting at every sound in the forest. Samuel returned on the 26th day. They heard him coming from a distance. He made no attempt to hide his approach, whistling a work song they all recognized from their plantation days. Elias met him at the edge of camp with a rifle they had found in the mine, then lowered it with a grin when Samuel's face emerged from the tree line. He looked good. Tired, thinner, but whole, alive, and the expression on his face told them everything they needed to know before he said a word. "It worked," Samuel said simply. "I found a broker, man named Hoskins, deals in, well, everything that respectable folks won't touch. He took the gold, asked no questions, charged me 15%. I got cash. Good cash, paper that we'll spend anywhere." He produced a leather wallet, fat with bills. They gathered around as he counted it out, $132. More money than any of them had ever seen in one place. More money than most slaves would earn in 10 lifetimes of labor. But Samuel wasn't finished. "I also made contact with someone else," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, even though they were alone on the mountain. "A Quaker woman named Mrs. Pemberton runs a boarding house that's actually a station on the Underground Railroad. She said if we can provide funds, she has routes that can move people north. $5 per person per stage, maybe 8 to 10 stages from Alabama to freedom. So $40 to $50 per person to get them all the way to Canada." The numbers hung in the air, heavy with implication. With $132, they could move 2, maybe 3 people to freedom, and they still had more gold in the mountain. Much more, if they kept working. "There's something else," Samuel said. "Mrs. Pemberton told me about a plantation near Talladega, the Whitmore place." Everyone went still. "She said Whitmore's been on a tear since he lost 7 slaves back in April. He's doubled his patrols, increased his brutality, made an example of anyone who even looks like they might run. She said he hanged a man just for being found with a map." The news settled over them like ash. They had escaped, but others were paying the price for their freedom. Whitmore was taking out his rage on people who had nothing to do with their running. "We have to do something," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "We can't just hide up here while people die because of us." "We are doing something," Ruth replied, but gently. "We're building resources. We're creating a network. We're making it possible for others to escape." "But not fast enough," Thomas persisted. "How many more will die while we're panning for gold?" It was the question none of them wanted to answer. They were doing important work, strategic work, work that could help many people over time. But strategy took time, and people were suffering now. "I've been thinking about this," Samuel said carefully. "What if we split our focus? Some of us keep working the mine, building the fund, but others, maybe just 2 or 3 of us, we make contact with Mrs. Pemberton's network. We use some of the money to start moving people now, while we're still accumulating more for later." "That means splitting up," Elias said. "Means some of us going into more danger, while others stay relatively safe here." "We've never been safe," Moses pointed out. "We've been lucky. There's a difference, and if Samuel can travel to Birmingham and back without getting caught, then maybe others can do similar work. Maybe we can be more than just miners hiding in the mountains." They talked long into the night, weighing options, assessing risks, trying to calculate the mathematics of courage and consequence. By the time they finally slept, they had made a decision. 3 of them would stay at the mine: Elias, Moses, and Thomas. They would continue working the gold, building the financial foundation for everything else. The other 4, Samuel, Ruth, Benjamin, and Daniel, would begin traveling circuits through the region, making contact with enslaved people who wanted to run, coordinating with the Underground Railroad, using their money to purchase freedom papers or bribe officials, or simply provide the resources that made escape possible. It was dangerous. It was probably insane. 7 escaped slaves turned into active abolitionists, working to dismantle the system that had enslaved them, funded by gold they had found in a forgotten mountain mine. But it was also right. They all felt it. This was what the gold was for. This was what their freedom meant, not just personal liberation, but the liberation of others. Not just survival, but resistance. Not just escape, but return. They would go back south, back into danger, back into the very places they had fled. They would use the master's gold, because that's what it felt like now, gold that represented all the wealth slavery had generated, to destroy the system that had created it. The South wasn't ready for what 7 freed slaves with resources and determination could do, but they were about to find out. Winter came to the mountains with snow and silence. The creek froze along its edges, making panning harder but not impossible. Elias, Moses, and Thomas worked the claims with a patience born of purpose. Every nugget they found, every ounce they accumulated, translated to freedom for someone still in chains. Meanwhile, in the lowlands, the others were building something unprecedented. Samuel's first trip back into the networks of slavery was to a small plantation near Selma. Using his forged papers and the confidence that came with having money in his pocket, he presented himself as a freedman looking for work. The master, a man named Turner, hired him for day labor without asking many questions. Free black labor was cheaper than maintaining slaves year-round. For 2 weeks, Samuel worked alongside the enslaved people of the Turner plantation, earning wages while quietly spreading a message. There was a way out. There were people with resources, contacts, a route to freedom. If you were willing to run, there were folks who would help you run smart. He identified 3 candidates: a young couple who had been trying to save enough to buy their freedom for years, and an older man who wanted to see Pennsylvania before he died. Samuel provided them with basic information: when to go, where to go, how to make contact with the next station, and gave each of them $5 in cash, enough to buy food, pay for a ferry crossing, bribe a suspicious official. 2 months later, word came back through Mrs. Pemberton's network. All 3 had made it to Philadelphia. Ruth took a different approach. She hired herself out as a domestic worker, moving from house to house in Birmingham. White families were always looking for experienced house slaves, and Ruth's skills were considerable. In kitchens and parlors, she whispered to other enslaved women, "There's a way. There are resources. You don't have to die here." She was careful, selecting only those who seemed truly desperate, truly committed. One wrong word to one unreliable person would mean the end of everything. But her caution paid off. Over the course of 6 months, Ruth helped arrange the escape of 7 people, all of them women, all of them reaching freedom in the North. Benjamin and Daniel worked together, posing as free black merchants traveling between cities. They had created a fiction about selling tools and equipment, the kind of business that gave them reason to travel and interact with plantations. The story was thin, but it held up under casual scrutiny, especially when backed by real money and real merchandise they purchased with their growing fund. Through these travels, they identified plantations with brutal overseers, places where escape attempts were common but usually failed. They provided intelligence to the Underground Railroad about patrol patterns, about which roads were watched and which were not, about friendly faces and dangerous areas. Back in the mountains, Elias tallied their accounts in a ledger he kept hidden in a metal box. By the end of the first year, they had moved nearly 40 people to freedom. The cost had been substantial, over $800 in total, between travel expenses, bribes, forged papers, and the fees paid to station operators. But they still had gold. The mountain kept giving, and they kept taking what it offered. The work was exhausting and terrifying. There were close calls. Benjamin nearly caught by a patrol outside Montgomery. Ruth questioned by suspicious officials in Birmingham. Samuel once spending 3 days hiding in a swamp because bounty hunters were working the area. But they learned from each mistake, adapted their methods, became more sophisticated. They developed codes and signals. They created multiple identities, multiple stories. They built a network of contacts, free black people, sympathetic whites, even a few slaves who stayed on plantations but passed information about who wanted to run and when. They became ghosts, moving through the South's slave economy, taking the system's own money and turning it into liberation. By the second year, they had expanded operations. Thomas came down from the mountain to join the circuit work. Elias stayed behind with Moses, working the mine, managing the finances, coordinating the increasingly complex operation through letters sent via the Underground Railroad's communication system. Their reputation grew quietly among enslaved people. Stories circulated in whispered conversations, passed from plantation to plantation. There were people out there helping, people with resources, people who had escaped and come back to free others. The stories were never specific. No names, no locations, just the knowledge that help existed if you were brave enough to seek it. Not everyone they tried to help made it. That was the hardest part. There was a family of 4 near Tuscaloosa, a mother, father, and 2 children, who Samuel had been working with for months. They had a solid plan, good timing, adequate resources. They ran on a moonless night in August of their second year. The father was caught 3 miles from the plantation. He was hanged the next morning as an example. The mother and children made it further, nearly 50 miles, before they were tracked down by dogs. They were returned to the plantation, where the mother was whipped within an inch of her life, and the children were sold separately to different owners. When Samuel learned what had happened, he stopped eating for 3 days. Ruth found him eventually, sitting by the creek at their mountain camp, staring at nothing. "We can't save everyone," she told him quietly. "I know," Samuel replied, "but we should have saved them, should have waited longer, planned better, given them more resources. You gave them hope," Ruth said. "You gave them a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. That matters, even when it ends badly." "Does it?" Samuel looked at her with hollow eyes. "Does hope matter if it gets you killed?" "Yes," Ruth said firmly, "because the alternative is no hope at all. Is accepting slavery as permanent, is dying without ever trying to be free. You think that mother regrets trying to save her children. You think that father regrets running toward freedom even though it cost him his life." Samuel didn't answer, but eventually he started eating again, started working again. The losses hurt, would always hurt, but Ruth was right. The alternative was worse. They weren't the only ones fighting back, of course. The Underground Railroad had been operating for decades, moving thousands to freedom through courage and careful organization. But what made their operation unique was the money. Most Underground Railroad operators were poor themselves, operating on faith and borrowed resources. But the mountain mine gave them something rare, consistent funding. By the 3rd year, they were supporting not just escapes, but broader abolitionist work. They funded the printing of pamphlets and newspapers. They helped pay legal fees for captured runaways. They supported safe houses and station operators who took enormous risks harboring fugitives. Mrs. Pemberton had introduced them to a wider network of activists. Quakers in Philadelphia, free black communities in Boston, even some white sympathizers in Alabama itself who worked quietly to undermine the slave system from within. The gold transformed from simple wealth into something more powerful, leverage. With money, they could influence outcomes, tip situations in favor of freedom, create possibilities that would otherwise never exist. But the gold was finite, and eventually Elias knew the mine would run dry. He could see it happening already. The easy pickings from the creek were gone. They were having to dig deeper into the shafts now, following thin veins that yielded less and less. They had perhaps another year, maybe 2, before the gold was exhausted, and they would have to survive on whatever funds they had accumulated. During one of their rare gatherings, when all 7 of them met at the mountain camp to coordinate and plan, Elias raised the concern. "We need to think about what comes after the gold," he said. "We've been fortunate, but this can't last forever. Eventually we'll need another source of funding, another way to sustain what we've built." "Land," Benjamin suggested. "We buy land somewhere in the north, establish a farm or business, create legitimate income." "A farm takes time to become profitable," Moses countered. And 7 black people suddenly owning property will raise questions. Same as the gold did, just slower. What if we don't all stay together? Daniel offered carefully. What if some of us settle down, establish normal lives, while others keep doing the circuit work? We could provide cover for each other, create legitimate fronts for the operation. It was a painful suggestion, because it meant breaking up the family they had become. But it was also practical. They couldn't hide in the mountains forever, and they couldn't keep risking exposure by all traveling the same circuits. They talked through the night, wrestling with decisions that had no perfect answers. By dawn, they had agreed on a framework. Elias and Moses would purchase land in Illinois, a state with growing free black communities. They would establish a farm that could serve as a way station and base of operations. The farm would provide legitimate income and a place where escaped slaves could rest and recover before continuing north. Ruth would remain in Birmingham, working as a domestic but continuing to coordinate escape attempts and intelligence gathering. Her established presence in the city was too valuable to abandon. Samuel, Benjamin, and Daniel would continue their circuit work, but more carefully, with longer intervals between trips to the same locations. They would rotate routes, vary their approaches, become even harder to track or identify. Thomas, the youngest, would go north for education. With their funds, he could attend school, learn properly, become the kind of educated leader the free black community desperately needed. His role would be building the future rather than fighting the present. It meant separation. It meant risk. But it also meant sustainability. They were thinking beyond their own survival now, thinking about building something that could last beyond them. 3 months later, Elias and Moses traveled north with $2,000 in cash and gold. They purchased 160 acres outside Springfield, Illinois, with a farmhouse and barn. They filed papers as freedmen from Tennessee, paid their taxes, and began the slow work of establishing themselves as legitimate landowners. The farm became known quietly among the Underground Railroad as a particularly safe station. Runaways could stay for weeks if needed, recovering strength, earning a bit of money working the fields, preparing for the final push to Canada. In Birmingham, Ruth rented a small house, unheard of for a black woman, but possible with cash and connections. The house had a hidden cellar where fugitives could hide for days if necessary. She maintained her cover as a domestic worker while running what amounted to a hotel for people fleeing slavery. Samuel, Benjamin, and Daniel continued their dangerous dance through the South, always moving, always careful, always pushing the boundaries of what was possible. They lost weight, gained scars, developed the kind of perpetual vigilance that never really shuts off. Thomas went to Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the few institutions that accepted black students. He wrote letters home describing his education, his amazement at being able to read any book he wanted, his dreams of becoming a teacher and bringing education to freed slaves. The mountain kept its secrets. The mine shaft stood empty most of the time now, yielding only small amounts of gold. But it had given them what they needed, a foundation, a start, proof that resistance was possible. By the end of their 4th year, they had helped free over 200 people, 200 souls who had been property and were now persons, 200 families reunited or started fresh in the North, 200 reasons to believe that slavery, as permanent as it seemed, could be challenged and defeated. The work was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But they had proven something important, that escaped slaves could be more than fugitives. They could be liberators. They could build something that mattered, something that would outlast them. The South noticed, eventually. Plantation owners began reporting strange patterns, unusually well-planned escapes, fugitives with resources they shouldn't have, white officials who seemed surprisingly willing to look the other way. Bounty hunters complained about trails that went cold at specific points, as if someone was providing intelligence about their movements. There were investigations, of course, rewards posted for information, crackdowns on free black people traveling without proper documentation. But the network had grown too large, too diffuse to be easily disrupted. For every person they caught, 5 others made it through. And behind it all, funding it quietly from their mountain mine and their Illinois farm, 7 people who refused to accept that their freedom meant abandoning others to slavery. They had found gold in the mountains, but what they built with it was worth far more than any amount of precious metal. They built hope, they built resistance, they built proof that the system could be beaten, and the South would never be quite the same. The telegram reached Elias at the Illinois farm in the spring of 1860. It was brief, coded in the language they had developed over years of careful communication. Mountain silent, last harvest complete, coming home. S. Elias read it twice, then walked out to the field where Moses was plowing. At 57 years old, Elias moved slower than he once had, his body carrying the accumulated weight of a lifetime of hard labor. But his mind remained sharp, his purpose clear. "Samuel says the mine is finished," Elias told Moses. "Last of the gold is out." Moses straightened from his work, wiping sweat from his brow. He was 40 now, his arm still bearing the scar from that first night in the mountains 14 years ago. "How much did we get total, by my accounting?" Elias pulled out the small ledger he always carried. "Somewhere around 300 ounces over all these years, maybe $6,000 worth at various prices. We've spent most of it, but we still have about 800 in reserve." The numbers were staggering when you thought about them. $6,000 found in a mountain and transformed into freedom for hundreds of people. $6,000 that represented thousands of hours of panning and digging, risk and hope. "Worth it?" Moses asked. "Every ounce?" Elias replied. Samuel, Benjamin, and Daniel arrived 3 weeks later. They had traveled carefully, taking separate routes, arriving at different times to avoid drawing attention. When they finally gathered in the farmhouse, the same 7 people who had run together in 1846, the years showed on all of them. Ruth had come up from Birmingham for the reunion. At 48, she moved with the careful stiffness of someone whose body had absorbed too much hard work. Her hair had gone grey, her hands scarred from years of domestic labor. But her eyes still carried that fierce intelligence that had kept them all alive. Thomas arrived from Oberlin, now 28 years old and barely recognizable as the terrified boy who had collapsed that first night of running. He carried himself with the confidence of an educated man, spoke with the precision of someone who had learned to use language as a weapon against injustice. They spent the evening sharing stories, calculating impacts, remembering the dead, and celebrating the living. By their best accounting, they had directly helped over 300 people escape to freedom. They had supported dozens of underground railroad stations. They had funded abolitionist newspapers, legal defense funds, and community-building efforts throughout the North. "The war's coming," Thomas said quietly. "Everyone at Oberlin talks about it. The tensions between North and South are unsustainable. Slavery's going to tear the country apart." "Good," Ruth said bluntly. "Let it tear. Anything that brings this evil system closer to ending is worth the cost. Easy to say when we're free," Benjamin pointed out. "Harder for the people still in chains who'll suffer through whatever war comes." "They're suffering now," Samuel countered. "At least a war might end it, might create something better afterward." The debate continued, as it had countless times over the years. What did freedom mean? What price was acceptable to achieve it? How much risk was justified by the goal? They had never fully agreed, would never fully agree, but they had learned to work together despite their differences. The next morning, Elias called them together for a specific purpose. "We need to decide what to do with the reserve funds," he said. $800 is enough to support operations for another year, maybe 2. But if Thomas is right and war is coming, we need to think about how our money can have the most impact. "Keep doing what we've been doing," Daniel suggested. Fund escapes, support the railroad. The work's not done just because the mine ran dry. But if there's going to be war, Moses said thoughtfully, maybe our money should go toward preparing for it, supporting the people who'll fight to end slavery rather than just helping individuals escape it. Why not both? Ruth asked. We split the funds. Half continues the immediate work of liberation. Half goes towards supporting whatever comes next, whether that's war, political organizing, community building, whatever the future needs. It was characteristic of Ruth to find the practical middle path. They voted, and her proposal won easily. $400 would continue funding the immediate work of the Underground Railroad and direct escape assistance. $400 would be donated to abolitionist organizations, preparing for whatever conflict was coming. But there was one more decision to make, and it was the hardest one. Should we tell people, Thomas asked, about the gold, about what we did, about how we funded all of this? Our story could inspire others, show them what's possible. Or it could get us killed, Benjamin countered. We're still fugitive slaves under the law. Whitmore's still alive down in Alabama, probably still looking for us. We tell our story publicly. We put targets on our backs. More than that, Samuel added. We put targets on every person we helped, every station we supported, every contact we've made. The whole network becomes vulnerable if our names and methods become public. They wrestled with it for hours. The temptation to be known, to be celebrated, to have their resistance recognized. It was powerful. They had done something extraordinary, something worth recording for history, but the risk was equally powerful. Finally, Elias made a decision. We don't tell the full story, he said. Not now. Not while slavery still exists and we're still at risk. But we make sure the story gets preserved somehow. We write it down, seal it, leave it somewhere it can be found later, when it's safe, when our names can't hurt anyone anymore. Over the next week they compiled their account. Elias wrote most of it, his careful script filling page after page with the story of 7 people who ran, who found gold, who used it to fight back. He recorded the names of everyone they had freed, 347 people in total, each one a victory against slavery's claim to permanence. He recorded their methods, their contacts, their routes. Not as a guide for others to follow, the specific circumstances were too unique, but as proof. Proof that resistance was possible. Proof that enslaved people had agency, intelligence, courage. Proof that the system could be beaten. When he finished, they sealed the document in a metal box, along with one final nugget of gold, the last piece they had kept as a reminder of where it all started. They buried the box on the Illinois farm, under a specific oak tree, with plans to retrieve it only when it was safe to tell the story publicly. Then they returned to work. The next 4 years were chaotic. War did come, just as Thomas had predicted. The southern states seceded. The Union fought to preserve itself, and slavery, the great evil that had defined American life for 2 centuries, finally began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. During the war, the 7 split up more completely than ever before. Thomas joined the Union Army as part of one of the new colored regiments, fighting to end slavery by force. Samuel and Benjamin continued Underground Railroad work, now with the tacit support of Union forces that needed intelligence about Southern territory. Ruth remained in Birmingham, using the chaos of war to help even more enslaved people escape. Moses and Daniel ran the Illinois farm, which became a major way station for refugees fleeing the South. Elias stayed on the farm too, coordinating, financing, supporting. His health was failing. Years of hard labor had caught up with him, but his mind remained sharp. He tracked every person they helped, maintained connections across the network, ensured their money went where it could do the most good. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, they gathered again at the farm to celebrate. It wasn't complete. The proclamation only freed slaves in Confederate territory, not in border states, but it was a start. It was acknowledgement that slavery was ending, that the fight they had waged for so long was succeeding. "We did it," Thomas said, tears streaming down his face. "Not just us, but everyone who fought, everyone who risked, everyone who refused to accept slavery as permanent. We actually did it. Not done yet," Ruth reminded him. "Proclamation is just words. Freedom has to be enforced, protected, built into something lasting." She was right, of course. The 13th Amendment wouldn't come until 1865, and even then, the fight for true equality would continue for decades, centuries even. But the foundation was crumbling, the system was dying, and 7 people who had run into the mountains in 1846 had played their part in killing it. Elias died in the winter of 1866, a free man on his own land, surrounded by people who loved him. He was 63 years old. His last words were instructions to Samuel about maintaining the network, continuing the work, never forgetting why they ran. The others continued for years after. Ruth lived until 1889, famous in Birmingham's free black community as a woman who had survived everything and helped countless others survive. Samuel became a teacher, using his literacy to educate freed slaves in the basics of reading and citizenship. Benjamin and Daniel opened a successful carpentry business in Chicago, employing other former slaves and funding civil rights organizations. Moses stayed on the Illinois farm until his death in 1892, maintaining it as a place where former slaves could stop, rest, and rebuild their lives. Thomas became a minister and educator, establishing schools throughout the South during Reconstruction. The mountain kept their secret. The mine shafts collapsed over time, reclaimed by forest and weather. The shacks rotted away. The creek ran clear and cold, any remaining gold buried too deep for casual prospectors to find. Locals told stories, of course. Strange tales about a hidden mine, about escaped slaves who found gold and used it for mysterious purposes. But the stories became legend, became folklore, became the kind of thing you heard at night around fires, but didn't quite believe in daylight. The metal box stayed buried under the oak tree for decades. When it was finally dug up in 1920, discovered by Samuel's grandson, who knew the story and wanted to preserve it, the contents were faded but readable. The account was typed up, copied, distributed quietly through black historical societies and abolitionist archives. The full story didn't become widely known until the civil rights movement of the 1960s, when historians began seriously documenting the complex ways that enslaved people had resisted their bondage. Even then, many details remained murky, filtered through time and incomplete records. But the core truth remained. 7 people had run into the Alabama mountains in 1846. They had found gold, and instead of using it for personal comfort, they had transformed it into liberation for hundreds of others. The final accounting, compiled years later by historians, estimated they had freed approximately 347 people directly, supported the escapes of hundreds more indirectly, and contributed thousands of dollars to abolitionist causes that helped end slavery entirely. 347 people who had been property became persons. 347 families who had been broken were made whole, or at least given the chance to be. 347 proofs that freedom was worth fighting for. Not bad for 7 people who were told they were nothing, owned nothing, deserved nothing. In the Alabama mountains, if you know where to look, you can still find traces of the old mine. The shafts are collapsed, the creek runs clear, the forest has reclaimed everything. But locals say that after heavy rains, you can sometimes see gold flakes in the stream bed, glinting in the sunlight like small promises. And carved into a rock face near the main shaft, barely visible after more than a century and a half, someone left a message. The words are worn almost smooth, but if you know what you're looking for, you can still make them out. We took what they buried and gave it back to the living. They didn't find gold. They found justice buried in the ground. And they used it to buy something that couldn't be purchased, only fought for and won. Freedom. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after. That's the legacy that mattered. That's the mountain's real treasure, and it echoes still.